It's a fundamental law of nature. For every action, there's a reaction. For each cause, an effect. That principle formed the Earth 4 billion years ago. Ever since, natural forces have continued to shape and transform our planet with devastating fury. Continental drift, volcanoes, and the occasional meteor have contributed to extreme climate changes, turning lush rainforests into desert wastelands, pure waterways into acidic mudflows, and clear air into a witch's brew of toxic gases. Natural forces have even driven thousands of species to extinction. But among the very few to survive was a creature with a large brain and opposing thumbs, a restless nomad with an insatiable need to master, transform, and exploit the world he lives in. Modern humans first appeared 100,000 years ago, but only recently has the hand of man left an indelible mark on the earth. The human compulsion to settle new lands and the ability to build labor-saving machines converged during the 18th and 19th centuries with far-reaching consequences few could have imagined. Then, North America was the prize, and Pennsylvania's vast natural resources provided the means for capturing it all. That was because Pennsylvania had it all. Deep ports and miles of waterways for inland travel and commerce, endless mountains bristling with timber for fuel and shelter, and something truly unique in the New World, huge deposits of fossil fuels and minerals, coal, oil, and iron. North America's uncharted frontier lay just west of Pittsburgh in 1804 when Lewis and Clark set off on their historic journey. For the next 150 years, Pennsylvania, its people, and its natural bounty literally built a nation and fueled America's rise as the world's leading industrial power. The rewards were great for the country and for generations of immigrant families, but so too were the costs, especially to the Commonwealth's once pristine air, water, and forests. When its industrial base faced near collapse, much of the Keystone State's environment lay in shambles, poisoned or used up. Well, that was less than 50 years ago. Since then, the economy has rebounded, and in many places, high tech has replaced heavy industry. That alone has breathed new life into the continuing efforts to restore Pennsylvania's environment. But before predicting where we're going, we must first measure how far we've come. And there's no better place to begin than with the story of a 4-generation family business, a family now intimately tied to preserving the most plentiful of all of Pennsylvania's natural resources, timber. Imagine landing in Pennsylvania nearly 400 years ago and finding a vast, uninterrupted forest as far as you could see, as far as you could walk, as far as you could dream. The earliest settlers of Penn's Woods were blessed with more than enough timber to build their communities, transport their goods, and fuel an economic boom that would last for centuries.
The first European settlers were primarily farmers and found the forest to be in the way. They used some of the trees for log houses and log barns, but a large percentage of the trees that were cut from the agricultural area were just piled and burned.
With 29 million acres of woodlands, the forest seemed limitless, and for more than a century, it was barely touched. But as basic needs for food and shelter were met, the settlers wanted items that would make their lives easier. In the late 1700s, this thirst for sturdier goods like tools sparked the production of iron, an industry that needed a dependable source of heat. By 1810, there were 44 iron furnaces in Pennsylvania. By the Civil War, over 150. And by the end of the 1800s, more than 3 million acres were cut repeatedly to fuel the iron industry. As the pioneers pushed westward during the early 1800s, they found one of nature's best building materials, a vast supply of white pine in northern Pennsylvania. The huge white pine logs were skidded to the river's edge during the winter months, then floated down the Delaware, the Susquehanna, or the Allegheny River to developing centers of commerce. Pennsylvanians took advantage of their forests to meet the needs of a prospering new nation. And by the mid-19th century, as the railroads and canals pushed north and west, Penn's woods were steadily falling to the lumberman's mighty axe. It was about this time that a young man from New York State named T.D. Collins crossed the border into northwest Pennsylvania.
He and his older brother invested in a small steam sawmill with and a 1,500 acres of timberland. And that was to be the start of a long and energetic career in the lumber business.
The story of the Collins family mirrors the story of Pennsylvania's and the country's forests. In 1855, our forests stood on the brink of the greatest utilization of wood products the world has ever seen. T.D. Collins saw a growing population, the spread of the railroads, westward expansion, and a vast forest resource. What he accomplished, along with other entrepreneurs of the 19th century, was the complete clear-cutting of Pennsylvania's forests. Through 4 generations of the Collins family business, we see the rise, fall, and rebirth of Penn's woods.
The timber companies at the turn of the century owned vast tracts of land, huge big tracts, warrants upon warrants, stacked one on top of the other. And when they started logging in an area, they started at one border and harvested until they got to the other border.
Timbering expanded with the birth of the logging railroad in 1885. No longer dependent on just water for transportation, the industry grew to meet the country's insatiable demand for lumber. But timber wasn't the only product being extracted from the forest.
Along with the development of the logging railroads came the development of the tanneries, which were looking for the thick hemlock bark as a source of tannic acid for both softening and preserving leather.
By the early 1900s, the need for wood byproducts fueled the final destruction of Pennsylvania's forests. Chemical wood companies produced wood alcohol, acetone, and turpentine to meet the demands of the Industrial Revolution.
Now the chemical wood cutters came in behind the loggers and cut everything. They cut down the small saplings and trees that were left following the logging. It was what you would consider a total clear cut.
And they all took from the land. They took whatever they could take to make themselves profits and to move on. And when there was no more to take, they moved right out of state and moved westward.
So, by the mid-1920s, there was very little original timber left.
Through the music of our axes, we'll make the woods resound, and many a tall and lofty pine comes tumbling to the ground.
Pennsylvania had lost almost 70% of its forests, shrinking from 29 million acres to just over 9 million acres. Like most turn-of-the-century lumbermen, T.D. Collins headed west. Unlike other landowners, he retained the title to his land.
The 2 million acres of state forest that we know today was acquired following the original logging in the early 1900s, with very little timber on and nothing but seedlings and saplings on much of the forest. And a lot of that land had been burned over.
While T.D. Collins' son Everell managed the family operations out west, their Pennsylvania lands were left to nature's hand, mostly forgotten. But in 1940, after Everell's death, his son Truman returned to settle his father's estate. On a long train trip across the country, Truman Collins pondered the fate of his family's lands.
When he got back there, they discovered that these lands were growing back very vigorously from the massive clear cuts at the turn of the century, and so they decided to hold on to those lands.
Nature had begun to heal itself. The barren landscape T.D. Collins abandoned years ago had nurtured a new forest. Across the state, a second growth forest was emerging, in part due to efforts of a new breed of men. People like Gifford Pinchot and Dr. Joseph Rothrock had pioneered the birth of modern forestry, a return to the Pennsylvania of plentiful resources, beauty, and opportunity. Guided by their foresight, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania worked to control the spread of wildfires, overseeing the large-scale planting of seedlings, and acquiring and protecting acres and acres of public land.
We have a second chance to learn from the mistakes that were made in the past, to look at the whole ecosystem and the whole picture in a landscape perspective, and to take those efforts and move them forward.
By the early 1970s, Pennsylvania's forests had staged a dramatic comeback. Left alone for more than half a century, they grew once again into a valuable resource, but a resource vastly different from the virgin forests of William Penn. Our original forests included lots of pine and hemlock, trees that loved the shade. But when the clear cutting opened the forest to sunlight, hardwood trees prospered. A new forest, a different forest, but a second opportunity to care for nature's bounty. When the Collins family returned to the timber business in Pennsylvania, they did it this time in a different way, serving as an environmentally sound model for the rest of the industry. In 1994, the Forest Stewardship Council certified the Collins Pennsylvania forest as a well-managed, sustainable source of natural hardwood.
Our timber harvests don't occur over every acre every year. We work in certain patches and we don't stay in one place for any length of time. We come back to the same areas from time to time, but we have acres of land that have not seen a saw for a long, long period of time. The recreation, the wildlife, the clean air, the clean water, the solitude can all occur on all those other acres at the same time, and I think that's real important. We're lucky we can have it all.
As the timber industry moves towards sustainable forestry, it is brokering balance on the economic and environmental scale. The forest is seen as much more than a valuable commodity, but a life-sustaining force that strengthens Pennsylvania's ecology and quality of life. Millions of acres are now carefully managed to ensure that we never return to the barren hills of yesteryear. Life beneath the trees is flourishing. Deer and poplar seedlings find safe harbor as natural habitats restore themselves. And people once again are drawn to these magical places, breathing life into the spirits of those who seek solace in nature's rejuvenating wonder. This may look like a rainforest, but it isn't. Exactly. It's really coal, give or take a few 100 million years. That's how long nature takes to make coal. And this is the stuff it's made of. Decayed prehistoric plant life. By some estimates, 70 feet of it to produce just a 6-foot vein of coal. Throughout the last 2 centuries, Pennsylvania's identity has been wed to coal. And why not? King Coal fueled America's Industrial Revolution, forged the first ingots of steel, made the trains run on time, and heated millions of American households. It also provided work for generations of immigrant families whose varied ethnic backgrounds wove the tapestry of Pennsylvania's unique cultural heritage. While King Coal pretty much replaced wood as a home heating fuel, the industry was oddly dependent on a steady supply of timber to construct and shore up its mines. Coal, in turn, was later dethroned by oil and natural gas. But before its decline, hard coal from Pennsylvania warmed the nation's homes, created jobs for a huge immigrant population, and formed an economic backbone for a quarter of the state's population.
Mining was a 150-year way of life in the Wilkes-Barre-Scranton area, and remember, a lot of people came to this country, they landed at Ellis Island, and they were brought into northeastern Pennsylvania for a new life. Now, as they learned this occupation, they became very good at it, and eventually this got into their blood, and they passed it on to their future generations.
The coal region became an enclave of strong ethnic identities, filled with men who labored long, women who raised large families, and parents who saw their children and grandchildren begin to achieve the American dream. Then, first gradually, and then suddenly, the boom was over. In the small town of Port Griffith, the Pittston coal vein lay next to and under the Susquehanna River. On January 22, 1959, laborers in the Knox mine heard a sharp popping sound, and then the roof gave way. Incredibly, the powerful river had smashed through the mine. Miners clambered for a foothold in the rising water, desperately searching for a way out. Miraculously, 27 escaped the rushing waters, but 12 men remained forever entombed in the Knox mine. The magnitude of the disaster was evident from the beginning. Efforts to plug the breach defied comprehension as immense railroad cars were tossed into the vortex. The Susquehanna River swallowed up untold cars and tons of rocks and boulders before the chasm was finally sealed. 7,500 miners were put out of work immediately. 20,000 would lose their jobs later. Most of the mines in the area were abandoned, leaving behind a scarred landscape, toxic waters, persistent underground fires, and towering comb banks. When it all began back in the middle of the 18th century, industrialists didn't intend to exploit northeastern Pennsylvania.
The bounty of the earth is there for us to take, and the idea of what happens to the waste wasn't important.
But what happens to the sulfuric acid and yellow boy precipitate is important today. Acid mine drainage kills aquatic plant and animal life. It is still the single largest source of water pollution in the state and Chesapeake Bay. The Lackawanna River that runs through Scranton was an early victim.
I can remember back in the late 50s crossing the river in the family sedan, and everybody rolled up the windows because 2 blocks away you could smell it.
30 years ago it was still dirty, it was still uninhabited by trout, and it wasn't until people start looking at the river and what they could do to help it that the river did start coming back.
The development of water treatment facilities resolved the sewage problems. And now, Pennsylvania is in the midst of a massive environmental cleanup, earmarking significant federal and state funds for water decontamination programs. But nothing is more important than grassroots organizations that bring the community into the effort. Composed of people who take pride in their towns, they pull trash out of the rivers and build trails and parks. The Lackawanna River Corridor Association is such a group. Since the late 80s, members of the LRCA have worked to promote projects that address water pollution, recreation, community development, land and water conservation, and public involvement with their river and watershed. One tangible effect of the turnaround in the fortunes of the Lackawanna is the return of the brown trout.
And it's amazing the size and the healthiness of these wild brown trout. The acidity levels and the pollutant levels of that mine drainage is decreased. Now that mine drainage is a benefit to the river because it provides cooling waters, 50-degree water, which is something which trout just thrive for. And the irony, of course, is that what killed the river at one time is now helping sustain it.
As governmental agencies keep a close watch, no new acid mine drainage problems are being created by today's coal mining industry. But the residual effects of mines operated before 1970 remain, and work continues to repair or neutralize the damage.
Settling ponds are one way to do it once the water's been neutralized. The orange that we associated with acid mine drainage, known as yellow boy, takes some time to settle out. And so what a pond does is allow that stuff to reside for a while in a still environment where it can precipitate down to the bottom. We have a citizens group that has a diversion well, which is a device that pulverizes limestone and adds it to the acid mine water in order to neutralize it.
Remining, one of the most promising developments, comes from the mining industry itself.
Now if an operator goes through and mines an area, he's got to reclaim the entire pit, even the work that's been done before. In that way, the mining company is doing a lot more reclamation than any of us could imagine, and it doesn't cost the taxpayers anything.
And then there's Centralia. Once a booming mine town, now a surreal landscape of fires that have smoldered for almost 3 decades. Here, a runaway trash fire spread throughout old mine tunnels, engulfing hundreds of underground acres. All efforts to douse the flames failed, forcing an entire town to be abandoned.
The federal money that was appropriated in the early 80s allowed for purchase of the properties, so people got good compensation for their property. They also got relocation money.
But the memory of leaving home is still painful to many.
Very sad time, and if I had the choice, I wouldn't have left Centralia.
Centralia is a painful reminder of our sacrifice to industrial prosperity. But from the ashes of loss rises new hope and promise.
Myself, I had an uncle move out to Long Island. He worked in a defense factory. And when they retired, they could not afford to live out there. So what they did, they moved back to Pennsylvania to be with their loved ones. And also, it was a nice, safe, clean area to live in.
There's environmental restoration, there's senior citizens walking, there's folks jogging and hiking.
The river as it stands now is 200% better than it was a year ago and 200% less than what it could be next year. So that the kids who are going to come along after we leave and hang up our waders are going to be able to enjoy this river more than we have.
Educators are teaching our children about the heritage of Pennsylvania's great natural resources.
Well, one of the things I tell them is these streams and these mountains haven't always been this way. The streams haven't been orange or black. The mountains haven't been full of deep, dangerous holes. We've done that.
We have thousands of acres of disturbed mine lands. We have miles and miles of disturbed, contaminated streams. It's going to take many, many years and hours of effort to clean these streams up, but we will get there.
The Surface Mining and Reclamation Act, the Clean Water Act, and other governmental initiatives have made great strides in restoring the quality of life. But individuals must tackle the issues in their own communities. We may not get our lands and waters back to the way they were in the 16th century, but we can reclaim their bounty and build on the restoration efforts underway.
And if we want to respect our waters and to get people to do work and to visualize them as what they can be and the promise that's there, we have to restore respect.
What kid hasn't had one of these at one time or another? When a Pennsylvania engineer invented the Slinky 55 years ago, he didn't have to go far to find the materials to build more. All the steel wire he would need could be had in less than a day's drive. And, as it turned out, he would need a lot. So far, 50,000 tons of steel has been produced to make 3 million miles of wire. And the Slinky is still going strong. Next to coal, there's probably no other natural resource so closely identified with Pennsylvania as steel. And when you talk steel, Pittsburgh is the place where it all started. In Pittsburgh, visionary Andrew Carnegie saw new uses for the iron ore abundant in Pennsylvania's landscape. In 1873, he began using this rich natural resource to build steel mills along the city's rivers. Soon, steel and iron products became Pennsylvania's largest single industry, attracting men from other parts of the United States and European immigrants. For nearly a century, Pittsburgh was the steel capital of the world, furnishing rails for the nation's locomotives, structural steel for its modern cities, and armament for national defense. Manufacturing propelled Pittsburgh into prominence, but it also created its biggest problems. The air was filled with smoke and soot from steamboats and trains, from homes where wood and coal were burned for heating and cooking, and from factories. As more manufacturing took root, more smoke poured into the air. The sky was dark at noon. Streetlights were on both day and night. Buildings were black and dirty. Pittsburgh now had a new name, Smoky City. For residents of western Pennsylvania, the smoke belching from industrial plants was little more than a daily nuisance, until Denora. On the evening of October 26, 1948, the people of this small working-class town went to bed, not knowing that a thick cloud of toxic gases and dust from the local zinc works would descend upon them.
It was an inversion set up where the air would not move and the fog just settled in, and that was it. It was like a blanket, and there wasn't a thing anyone could do about it. And it was strong and powerful. You couldn't see your hand in front of your face. There was no sound, there was nothing. There was no one out. No vehicles, not a thing. It was just still. It made you feel kind of strange.
The noxious fog was more suffocating than anything any Denoran had ever seen. Before dissolving, it would kill 20 people and sicken nearly 7,000, half the town's population. William Schemp and other volunteer firemen worked tirelessly to bring oxygen to residents struggling to breathe.
When the time comes that you can't get your breath, you're in real trouble. They just couldn't go through it any longer or put up with it. They couldn't survive. So we helped those we were able to help as much as we could, and the rest, why, I guess they were the ones to be given credit for bringing something to life here that we never realized was in existence.
The Denora tragedy stunned the nation and was the turning point for complacency on the health effects of industrial pollution. It gave birth to America's clean air movement and forever dissolved the notion that pollution just dirtied the sky. In nearby Pittsburgh during the 1940s, people wanted change. They wanted to breathe fresh air, to work in a clean downtown, and see the sun and blue sky more often. There was an excitement, a will to build a new city, one their forefathers never thought possible. An enormous gathering of energy and leadership launched the Pittsburgh Renaissance. Smoke control was the key element of change.
At that time, we were highly reliant on bituminous coal, which is a highly volatile and highly polluting fuel. And it was being utilized not only in industry, but also in residential heating. Women would hang out their wash, and you'd have the fallout from the smoke. Men would change their shirts more than once a day, and visibility was very bad. And it wasn't until after the Second World War that they implemented smoke control regulations, in which there was a huge conversion from soft coal to cleaner fuels, in particular natural gas, but also diesel fuels.
The switch in home heating sources, along with a remarkably successful pollution control program, changed the environment and entire image of the city. By 1955, Pittsburgh's thick smoke had begun to clear. The once filthy mill town was transformed into a dazzling metropolis in one of America's most amazing environmental victories. Other industrial cities followed Pittsburgh's lead and scrubbed their air with equally remarkable results. In 1959, the Air Pollution Control Act was passed, creating Pennsylvania's first comprehensive statewide program to regulate air contaminants. The impact of smog on Denora was a key motivation. 10 years later, the Group Against Smog and Pollution, or GASP, was formed to further improve the quality of life for Pittsburgh residents. GASP believes that industry, government, universities, and citizens must work together toward the goal of creating a sound economy with a clean environment.
If you educate the public, they will see that there's hope. to improve environmental quality. We're situated in a beautiful spot at the juncture of three rivers. We should capitalize on those rivers, and we should not let environmental quality lag behind.
For the steel industry, which launched Pittsburgh into dominance during the industrial age, environmental stewardship has become an integral part of business strategy.
We've spent over $400 million at Clairton in pollution control, and it's worked. That's the biggest coke plant in the country, and that's the standard by which all other coke plants are judged for cleanliness. That's a tremendous success. At the other end of the production, recycling has been an enormous success for the steel industry. But we don't want our product going in landfills. So we do our best to take it all back and convert it into more useful steel products.
Pittsburgh is poised to lead the nation once again. Just as big steel catapulted the city to greatness over 100 years ago, high technology is the impetus today. Forest Systems is a leading global supplier of networking solutions that has not forgotten Pittsburgh's past. Just as Andrew Carnegie once used steel to build the nation's infrastructure, Ford is using its high-tech computer systems to build networks of steel for the new millennium.
By embracing Pittsburgh's industrial heritage, Forest Systems had bucked at least 2 decades old trend where companies around Western Pennsylvania were really scrupulously trying to avoid any references to Pittsburgh's industrial heritage. We sort of turned that on its head. We said, hey, you know what? Pittsburgh has so much to be proud of. We were so influential in the development of this country. The networking infrastructures we supply are much like the steel infrastructures that the city of Pittsburgh developed, the bridges, the roads, the machinery that the country was built upon.
Although Pittsburgh and the nation have come a long way since Denora, more work needs to be done. The veil of air pollution still lingers in ground-level ozone, today's smog. But as Pittsburgh navigates another renaissance where quality of life is the new imperative, blue skies and clear waters take center stage. The once blackened city shines as it embraces its newfound legacy. We are born in water, made mostly of water, and we depend on water for our very existence. In many ways, Pennsylvania's inland waterways gave birth to a nation. They served as the first overland arteries for travel and trade and provided power to run the grist mills. Pennsylvania's rich limestone, spring, and freestone streams also nourished countless ecosystems, which in turn provided sustenance for animal life and food for Pennsylvania's earliest settlers. But over the centuries, the waters became fouled, and it was Pennsylvania's own Rachel Carson who sounded the alarm in her book, Silent Spring. Today, cleaning up and restoring Pennsylvania's rivers, lakes, and streams has taken center stage. And in one place, the unlikely duo of a nun and a fish named Freddie are taking the lead. In the northwest corner of the state lies one of the country's greatest natural resources, Lake Erie, an immense body of water that provided a crucial link in our commercial prosperity, transporting Pennsylvania's raw materials to a burgeoning nation. And as growing demands for manufactured goods fueled the Industrial Revolution, the city of Erie emerged as a prolific producer of metal products and machinery. Other industries followed: paper, plastics, and rubber, shipbuilding, and commercial fishing. And in 1914, as Pittsburgh was producing steel for railways, Erie started making freight and passenger locomotives. But as Erie's productivity strengthened America's vitality, the vitality of the lake was slowly slipping away. Heavy industry along the shores and inadequate sewage treatment severely polluted the waters. For decades, tons of chemicals, oils, and human waste drained into the lake and neighboring Presque Isle Bay. "50 years ago, Lake Erie was known as the most ecologically abused of all the Great Lakes.
Presque Isle Bay and Lake Erie in general probably were its worst in the early 60s to mid 60s. It was a time when people started realizing that there were problems. Dead fish were being noticed. Algae was so thick in Presque Isle Bay in certain places you couldn't physically row a boat through it. At that point, Silent Spring had been written, and they're realizing that they had the problem in their own backyard, you know, with pollution, and there was an environmental awakening about that time.
Some critics declared the lake dead. Others warned it would expire if the pollution continued. The hard-working men and women of Erie were on the edge of a new revolution. In 1972, Congress passed the Clean Water Act in response to rising concern about water pollution in the lakes, rivers, and coastal areas across the United States. The law restricted discharges of phosphorus, PCBs, and other toxic chemicals into the nation's waters. For Lake Erie, the legislation, along with new technology and an energized community, forced a shotgun marriage, a new balance between our economic and ecological desires.
But I think the biggest thing that's happened in the Great Lakes in the last 25 years is that the governments of U.S. and Canada have committed over $12 billion to building and upgrading sewage treatment plants that discharge into the basin. That fact alone and the tight controls that we've placed on industry have just made a tremendous difference to what we see today.
People who once refused to take a dip in Presque Isle Bay now bask on its sandy beaches. Water quality has visibly improved, and aquatic communities are coming back to life.
One of the interesting things that we've noticed that has shown a dramatic improvement in water quality is the return of mayflies to the Lake Erie. Mayflies were plentiful before the Industrial Revolution. After we got huge amounts of organic pollution, industrial pollution into the lake, it caused oxygen depletion in the bottom sediments and the mayflies died out. Well, we've now noticed that the mayflies have returned. This is a water quality indicator, and conditions are getting much better than they used to be.
Although the major sources of pollution have been reduced, another, more complex challenge remains. Jim Rutkowski's biology students at Strong Vincent High School have identified organic sources of pollution that may be affecting Erie's fish.
Polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons are one of the problems that may be causing some tumors on the brown bullheads in Presque Isle Bay. These chemicals have been deposited through the burning of fossil fuels, coal dump, and coking facilities. And in the process, these PAHs tend to get into the soil and then work their way gradually into Presque Isle Bay and the lake.
Fish exposed to contaminants store them within their bodies. When people eat these fish, they ingest small amounts of toxins without realizing it. But the greatest threat comes from excessive fish consumption. Those most at risk are children, women of childbearing age, and people who regularly consume Lake Erie fish. At Villa Maria Academy, students developed Freddy the Fish to advise the public about the potential dangers of eating select species.
We have pamphlets out that have our character Freddy the Fish on the front, and they have all the information from preparing it to what fish you should eat and how often.
Freddy the Fish was developed under the guidance of the local Earth Force chapter, which encourages young people and educators to make sustainable changes in their community. It's steered by Sister Pat Lupo, a unique individual with a real passion for the earth.
We need to make people, first of all, aware of the environment and to appreciate it, because otherwise they're not going to be motivated to change. And what we're trying to do with the youngsters is to not only educate and motivate them to act, but also to model that for them. Kids are great teachers, that then they take that home and try to implement some of that stuff with their own families and friends.
In Erie, community involvement has long been apparent. in groups like the Sons of Lake Erie or Save Our Native Species. Sons was formed 20 years ago to improve fishing in the area. Despite broad efforts to improve Lake Erie, new environmental challenges from exotic species threaten. One of the most vexing is the zebra mussel. In 1988, it was carried into the Great Lakes in ballast water from a European cargo ship. Just 1 year later, zebra mussels had colonized on the surface of nearly every firm object in Lake Erie. Oddly, the invasive organisms actually helped clear the water, but at great cost to native fish populations. Their overwhelming presence poses a serious economic threat to commercial and sport fisheries. The round goby was also deposited here by ship ballast water. Millions of round gobies thrive in the Great Lakes Basin because they are aggressive, voracious feeders. Gobies displace native fish, take over optimal habitat, and change the balance of the ecosystem. As we move toward a global economy, a more global ecosystem emerges. Controlling the introduction of non-native species that change the environmental landscape is a top priority. In these waters, the Great Lakes states have invested millions of dollars in technologies to control ballast water impacts. They, and other groups like the Pennsylvania Sea Grant, are looking for solutions to these problems, ensuring long-term environmental and economic health for the region. But things have changed dramatically since the 1960s. No longer is Erie tagged as the mistake on the lake. The revitalized waterfront stands as a tribute to the thinking that a good environment is good for business. Cleaner waters attract people. Some 4 million tourists every year funnel dollars into the local economy. And at Presque Isle State Park, swimmers soak up the rays on miles of beaches. Nature lovers discover diverse, rare plants and animals. Canoeists explore the mystery of the lagoons. And boaters navigate the bay's open waters. One of the biggest challenges for Erie and the nation is to resist complacency.
My generation is really taking a big step right now and trying to preserve what we have and deal with it. So through that, we're educating, which is a key thing you have to do. You have to educate. What we need to do is we need to realize that this is a problem we have right now. We need to start dealing with it and helping it so that we have an environment in the future.
When you think about it, it's truly ironic. Some of the same natural resources that made Pennsylvania a world leader over the last 200 years have now combined to create a new, distinctively 21st century environmental threat. Fossil fuels, steel, and wood. Put them all together, and they spell urban sprawl. It's only been in the last 50 years, since the end of World War II, that we've been confronted with the phenomena called urban sprawl. Even then, few could have predicted the consequences of America's love affair with the car, more and better highways, and the urge to move to the country. And fewer still could have foreseen the complex environmental problems that would result. Of all our natural resources, water, air, wildlife, and plants, land is the only resource that cannot renew itself. No matter how hard we try, we just can't make any more of it. Since 1970, the population of Pennsylvania's towns and cities has grown by 13%. But the amount of land consumed for our homes, businesses, and factories has skyrocketed 81%. And we've eaten up more than 1 million acres of prime farmland. And every time we change our land, pave it, build on it, bulldoze it, or dig it up, we change it forever. We take away something we can't get back. Open space provides a filter for our drinking water, a habitat for wildlife, and a place for recreation. It's a place for trees and plants to grow, a place to recharge our spiritual batteries. Without open space, our lives are diminished. But whose land should remain open? Yours? Mine? Who gets to decide? 50 years ago, Americans had a dream. Automobiles and highways freed us from our towns and villages. Prosperity freed us from depression. Victory freed us from fear. And as we stood on the threshold of greatness, our view was without limits. In the midst of all this prosperity, returning vets and baby boom families wanted nice places to live, away from the city, away from the crime, the noise and congestion. A place where you could actually own your own little piece of paradise. Enter Bill Levitt.
When Bill Levitt was serving in the Far East of the United States Army, he used to tell his buddies when he gets back home, he's going to build affordable housing so they could all get a piece of the American dream. And he did just that. He built here the first fully planned residential community in America that would have no traffic lights, that you could walk from one end of town to the other. But he didn't build a community, he built the world.
The land seemed endless, the optimism without limit. But the suburban dream that sprouted in Levittown blossomed into a nightmare. The suburbs have expanded. All the problems of the city have come with us. Noise, congestion, traffic, and taxes. The governor's 21st Century Environment Commission now calls land use the most pressing environmental issue facing Pennsylvania today. Nowhere is the issue of urban sprawl more prevalent than here in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, a region stretching 40 miles from the state's largest urban center to the rural fields of eastern Pennsylvania. It's a microcosm of our past, present, and future. Lower Bucks County, home to Levittown, is a crowded, bustling suburb bordering Philadelphia. Central Bucks, with its small towns, suburban malls, and single-family homes, is now undergoing a rapid transformation. Bucolic Upper Bucks, with its large farms and covered bridges, is home to most of the county's open space, and it's ripe for development.
Bucks County has been one of the fastest-growing counties in the Commonwealth since the Levitts built 17,611 homes in a 6-year time period, and it scared the heck out of municipal officials. Growth is going to happen in Bucks County. Started a long time ago, and it's going to continue.
The challenge for Bucks County, all of Pennsylvania, and indeed the nation, is to manage that growth in a responsible way. We need to find places for people to live and work without destroying the quality of life that attracted us here. In Pennsylvania, local zoning boards traditionally make land use decisions. According to state law, every municipality must permit every type of land use within its borders. But 30 years ago, several Bucks County municipalities came up with a novel idea: to plan jointly instead of separately. The Quakertown Area Planning Committee was the first joint municipal planning group in the state.
Yeah, we could see Lower Bucks developing, and we could see the beginnings of the development in the middle of Bucks County, and we knew that we were essentially next as the development moved toward us. And we thought it would be more effective if we developed common goals and objectives, and also if we developed common ordinances. We thought it would be more efficient to do it that way, and also it gets the municipalities cooperating with each other.
By planning together, the 6 municipalities were able to locate each type of land use only once in the region, instead of in each township and borough. They were able to put each kind of development where it makes the most sense, and prevent development from occurring where it doesn't belong.
It used to be that there was this inevitable march of development across the county, and that was sort of the future that we saw. But I think people are now seeing that we can in fact have a mix of development that's done sensibly and preservation of areas that are just critically important, that have defined Bucks County for the last 300 years.
What has defined Bucks County, what makes it an attractive place to live, is the beauty of the landscape. Farms dating back to William Penn, Washington's Crossing, covered bridges, and an active agricultural community. Working together, the Quakertown Area Planning Committee has saved many of these treasures from the bulldozer.
We have the big developers moving in, have built their 221 units here, 112 units there, and there are relatively intense pressures. But we've learned from those experiences in other areas that are urbanizing and have found that if you're proactive and get in front of the development, that's the real key.
Not all land is right for development. While it's important to find the right places to build, it's just as important to preserve the open space and farmland that already exist.
We've lost about 80% of our farms since 1945. Right now there's only about 20% of the county remaining in agriculture. And we feel that we need to take action now or we won't have any agriculture left in about 20 years.
So open space preservation, historic preservation, farmland preservation, working together are all tools that we have used extensively, particularly in the last couple of years, in order to preserve the character of the landscape of Bucks County.
Citizens and local governments are preserving open space by donating and buying development rights. This gives financial rewards to landowners who agree not to develop their land. Bucks County voters have approved more than $50 million in the past 2 years to help preserve open space and farmland. The reuse of abandoned commercial sites is another key to responsible growth. Revitalizing existing properties makes more sense than paving over valuable agricultural fields. By recycling these so-called brownfields, developers can take advantage of existing roads, utilities, and other municipal services. But using land wisely is only part of the challenge. Our land is more than just beautiful scenery. Open, unpaved land filters and protects our water supply.
Sprawl can have multiple impacts on water resources. One of the greatest is that as we sprawl out over the landscape, we're increasing the number of rooftops, the number of parking lots, and in those areas, water can't get back into the ground. And it's the groundwater that we use for water supply.
All across America, citizens, developers, environmentalists, and local officials wrestle with the issue of land use. People have to live somewhere. Growth has to occur. How do we balance economic and environmental concerns? Will our grandchildren see these choices as the right ones? Or will they look back on us and call us short-sighted?
Development is going to occur. We don't want to stop development, but it's just how we look at development. And what we need to do is educate the home buyers, the township officials, county officials, legislators, that there is a way to promote development while still obeying nature's laws.
For every choice, there's a consequence. For each decision, an outcome. Andrew Carnegie, one of Pennsylvania's most notorious industrialists, once remarked that eventually we shall all be barbarians to our great-great-grandchildren. Carnegie seemed to know how future generations would judge the damage he and others had done to Pennsylvania's environment. But it would be unfair to demonize all those who exploited the natural resources around them. Ignorance, necessity, and the basic need to survive contributed greatly to the abuse of the environment. Many choices were made without considering the consequences, or even that there would be any long-lasting effects. And without the exploitation of Pennsylvania's lands and waters, America might never have risen to its prominence as an industrial world leader. Today, we no longer depend on nature alone for our existence. We now have the time to devote to things other than survival. Things like our quality of life, the desire for cleaner, safer communities, and that has spawned a renewed public interest in conservation and preservation of the environment. Science and technology can now allow us to detect, measure, and sometimes even repair the damage to fragile ecosystems. And the commitment of individuals, real involvement in making things better, can turn the tide. But in the end, the final decisions are ours, and what we decide will have consequences, good or ill for generations to come. Will our great-great-grandchildren think of us as barbarians? That's for us to decide.